Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Payments Compliance Outlook 2025 podcast here at MPE in Berlin. I'm Jimmy, a senior journalist at Vixio, where I cover regulatory developments across the EU and UK. Before we dive in on what I don't doubt will be an incredibly fruitful discussion about the many, many regulatory topics affecting our industry, let me introduce Vixio. We're a regtech company providing independent, actionable regulatory intelligence for compliance, strategy, and development professionals. Our mission is to help businesses navigate regulatory change, both challenges and opportunities, so that they can stay compliant while gaining a competitive edge. I'm joined today by Arie, a seasoned fintech professional hailing from the Netherlands. Arie.
Yes, thank you. So I'm a lawyer at Finnick Legal, a Dutch law firm, and I'm providing legal and regulatory advice to fintech companies. I'm working a lot with payment and e-money institutions on licensing procedures in the Netherlands, but also on compliance and regulatory topics. So very happy to be here and to touch upon some of those topics.
Certainly a lot coming up, and really looking forward to exploring some of the key regulatory trends that are shaping payments at the moment. We've got PSD3, we've got PSR, instant payments regulation coming in this year, fraud prevention, emerging compliance challenges for merchants and payments providers alike. And with so much happening, where would you like to start?
There's a lot of things happening in PSD3 and PSR, so I think it would be nice to start there.
I agree. I think that PSD3 and PSR definitely something that are going to be hopefully signed off this year. So we're probably going to see some quite rapid developments happening there once the council has agreed their position. I remember when this was coming out a few years ago now, everyone was saying that it was going to be an evolution, not a revolution. I'm wondering whether that's actually the case once you start to dig into it, because there are some quite significant changes in it. I think one area that will be quite a big deal for some merchants, at least, will be changes to the commercial agent exemption.
Yes.
It really seems to be being tightened up. Maybe that's not so much of a surprise considering PSD1 and PSD2 and the changes that came there for the commercial agent exemption. But what kind of reforms are we looking at when it comes to what changes the Commission wants?
Yes. So what the European Commission and the European legislator has seen is that the commercial agent exemption is used by, for example, large online platforms that are doing like large volume transactions each year or each month. These transactions are lacking the protection of PSD2. And therefore, under PSD3, they're trying to tighten the rules for the commercial agent exemption. For example, one of the things is that it must be a commercial agent within the meaning of a regulation on self-employed agents, which means that the large platforms, they're not like self-employed commercial agents, so they would not qualify for that. Another one is that they cannot act on behalf of both the buyer and the seller, so they have to act for one of those. And the last one is that they should also have like a real margin to negotiate. So they cannot just bring together like the buyer and the seller, but they also need to be actively involved in the kind of the commercial process.
Yeah, the real margin was actually a part of it that really stood out to me, only because I imagine if you're a large online marketplace, maybe you've got an international market that you're dealing with, are you going to have very specific rules, let's say, for the EU with real margins to negotiate? And is this something we see in the market at the moment?
I personally, I don't see it a lot. Like you can imagine that you have a platform where if I want to buy an insurance, they go to different platforms or to different insurers and they get the best price. That would be a possibility, but usually, like if you buy something at a large marketplace, the seller presents a price, and then the platform has nothing to do with it, right? So I think potentially all of those platforms would either need a license or they would need to use like a licensed PSP for processing the payments.
Yeah, I think this is one of those areas that is a bit of a dark horse with the PSD3 and PSR changes, because I think all of us have got very tied up in the conversation about fraud, and we will be discussing fraud later on. But yeah, I think commercial agent exemption or exclusion is definitely going to be an area that people, especially merchants, need to be paying attention to in the coming months, because this could be an area that you could have to be dealing with changes and potentially having to think about getting a payments license. Another piece of the legislation that stood out to me was the limited network exclusion, kind of similar to what they're doing with the commercial agent exemption. They seem to be tightening the rules there as well. And I
Yes.
wondered, with the limited network exclusion, what kind of things could we see changing with PSD3 and the PSR?
Yes. So again, you see that the limited network exemption is applied very differently among different member states, and therefore some of those like exemptions use like different like payment purposes,
Yeah.
and it should be restricted to just one single product or service. And so that's one of the changes that the PC3 and PSR will bring. The other one is that the payment must actually take place in physical premises, which means that, you know, online purchases would not be allowed with the single purpose payment instruments. So potentially, again, a lot of those cards that are being used, for example, if I have a card that I can use in certain department stores, but also, for example, for certain purposes like fuel cards, and you combine those two, that would not be possible anymore. Or if I have to buy online, that is also not possible anymore.
What do you think of the drivers for that change? And is this something that you think could be quite impactful for merchants?
Well, in the end, like if the merchant issues his or her own card, which is usually what happens, right? Like the department store has their own card. Um, Still, if the card can be used only in your physical premises and only in your department stores, I don't think a lot would change. But if I'm a merchant who is also not just offering his or her own products, but also products of someone else, where I'm combining, for example, purchasing goods in my store with purchasing goods from another store, that would potentially, well, either I would need to restrict it to certain products or services, or just my department stores, or I would need to obtain a license. So there would be definitely be some potential impact there.
Interesting. Yeah, another area where merchants are really going to have to be paying attention to what the final conclusions that the co-legislators make. I think at the moment the rumor is that it should be July that they managed to get this piece of legislation signed off. Obviously, that can be subject to change. We don't know what's going to happen with people in Brussels, because they do tend to change their minds quite a lot, as people have seen with the recent open finance legislation. So this is an area that definitely people need to be paying attention to, and there are likely to be some final changes for the text that eventually gets agreed. Now, moving on to fraud, as promised, I think another area that would be good to tackle would be the strong customer authentication changes that the European Commission has proposed. Now, with strong customer authentication, it can't be denied that it has been a bit of a success story, and certainly the statistics that the European Central Bank, the European Banking Authority, and others have been releasing, they've seemed like they've been quite vindicated. I certainly remember speaking to people prior to strong customer authentication getting introduced, and often at that time, this was merchants who were particularly worried about it. Now that it's in, what do they actually want to do to improve it, or potentially make things more challenging with the PSR and PSD3?
Yeah, so actually, if you look at strong customer authentication, actually, the rules are a little bit softened, because it used to be like you need to have like two different factors. And now, actually, for authentication, it can be just one factor, provided that if you use the factor 2 times, one doesn't compromise the other. So potentially, I could use one factor 2 times, which is something that I think the European Banking Federation opposed to. But I think the strong customer authentication is not always the real problem, because the real problem is that people are often authenticating a transaction when they're being tricked into it. And that's where, for example, the APP fraud comes in. And there's a lot of impact there with respect to PSD3 and PSR.
And with authorized push payment fraud, as someone who lives in the UK, this has been something that we've been trying to tackle. Payment systems regulator brought in some quite heavy reimbursement requirements last year for payments firms, which was fought against quite a lot by fintech firms, mainly because I think it was originally 415,000. That was the maximum. Then it got lowered to 85,000, which is still quite a lot. Is the EU looking at doing something similar here?
Yes. So I think, first of all, probably the APP frauds are a little bit broader in scope than the European rules, because they're just talking about impersonation frauds. So,
Yeah.
for example, like a romance fraud would most likely not be covered by that. Having said that, there's no cap on the liability. So the cap is an indefinite amount, and it's linked to like someone using the name or the email or the company logo to trick someone into a payment. Then obviously potentially the PSP cannot prevent that or has nothing to do with it. If we're talking about just using a name, anyone can use my name, but I cannot control who uses my name. A phone number is maybe different, but with a phone number, I would need the cooperation of the electronic communication network providers to block those numbers from being used by other persons. So there's, I think, a strong link to not just the payment service providers, but also other providers like hosting providers who also have a role in that. And that's where initially the PSD3 and PSR proposal said nothing about the electronic communication network providers. Now in the new draft that was prepared and that was also approved by the European Parliament, there's also a liability for the electronic communication network providers if they don't act after having been informed. So I think that's a very important improvement. But still potentially there's a risk that if you get reimbursed just because you were easily fooled, that you're not paying the proper attention to what you're actually doing. So there's a risk if you just reimburse everyone except for like fraud or gross negligence, which is very hard to prove. There's a risk that people just well, potentially there's even a business case for frauds just to act together with a payer to get reimbursed and then split whatever is paid out. So I think there's kind of a regulatory risk in that. So I don't know if the current proposal has the right balance between, on the one hand, protecting the consumer, and on the other hand, also taking into account that sometimes the consumer also plays a very important role in those fraud cases.
I think something that I'm seeing across the payments ecosystem at the moment has been a bit of a push to increase consumer awareness and education when it comes to fraud. In the UK last year, we had a National Fraud Week, and in some of the soap operas, there were different storylines relating to different kinds of fraud that could happen, which probably would fall under the app fraud bracket. I think that it's a really important issue to confront, but it's one that definitely is quite divisive. And one of the things I wonder at the moment is whether elsewhere is actually going to follow what the UK has done. I think that with the liability shifting beyond just payment service providers, yes, payment service providers would be very happy about that. And it's something that I think they often feel isn't really their fault if the app fraud begins on a social network. But again, incredibly political topic, and I don't know whether it's something that the European Commission and others are going to want to try and tackle with this piece of legislation. So it's going to be one to watch. I wonder if confirmation of payee or verification of payee, which is coming in with instant payments, do you think that's going to be able to help solve this?
Well, I think it definitely makes a big improvement, because in the Netherlands we've already had the verification of payee
Yeah.
for quite a while without there being an obligation to provide that. And I think the numbers of, for example, people just making the wrong payment, not even fraud cases, but just they put in the wrong number or something like that. I think it went down with 80%. And then also, of course, it will be harder for fraudsters to defraud a victim. So I definitely think that makes a big difference, certainly. But then again, what do you do if the verification of payee system doesn't work? There's always outage, and there's a liability on the PSP if they don't perform the check or the result is wrong.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's a big question. If I'm the verification of payee provider, the bank is going to want me to give like a very high service level, and then potentially I would want to have like a second verification of payee provider as a backup, because in the end, if the payment goes through and it's fraudulent, I have to pay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I wonder whether the confirmation payee or verification payee, it's confirmation of payee in the UK, and I assume that's been the case in the Netherlands until now. We have a similar system, I think. But I wonder whether there's a case for like gross negligence when it comes to that. For example, if someone hasn't checked the person once they've done the name check, should that mean that they get reimbursed afterwards? I think that could be potentially a place that legislators could look at to be
Yeah,
potentially.
well, it currently doesn't. So if the check is not performed or is wrong, then the PSP is liable, and it has nothing to do with what the payer did or did not do.
Yeah.
So
It's a very difficult situation, and I think with instant payments as well. Obviously, there are some nations where instant payments have definitely taken off. UK, one of the Netherlands as well with Ideal, Sweden, but then there's plenty of economies in the EU at the moment, which are going to have quite a shock when instant payments suddenly goes up quite a lot with this new regulation. And I wonder, are we going to see, and this will probably be merchants and payment providers' worst nightmare, fraud go up with that? When you speak to banks, they do say that they are anticipating some fraud to go up, but hopefully verification of payee proves to be a blocker in the way that it has been in the UK with fraud statistics.
yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely an issue to be looking out for. I think another field, maybe not so much in the PSD3 and PSR world, that is worth considering is buy now pay later. Buy now pay later is an area that is becoming more regulated in the EU and the UK as well, with the Consumer Credit Directive, which is being introduced. It would be good to talk about buy now pay later because I think that it offers a lot of opportunities to merchants, particularly when they want consumers to make bigger purchases, and it does offer some benefits to consumers by being able to break up those potentially bigger payments. With buy now pay later being regulated, do you think that this is something that is helpful to merchants, that is going to be helpful to consumers, or do you think that this is something that perhaps is going to limit, quite an exciting new payment method?
Yes. Well, again, here we see that there's a big concern from the European regulator of like people overspending and being induced to overspend when they cannot afford it. So the CCD2 is trying to prevent that by putting very strict requirements on like the consumer credit provider. He has to do like affordability checks. He has to provide a lot of pre-contractual information, etc. And we actually had a discussion on that yesterday. And then one of the participants in the discussion, one of the panelists, showed an example of like, I buy like socks for 10 euro, and then the information I have to provide, the credit checks I have to do, and potentially even having to identify this person before being able to provide the credits. I think that's if that is the case, and it certainly looks like it, then I think that is overregulation, and that is not going to help the consumers, because in the end it's part of a bigger problem, and the bigger problem is that a lot of people just have a lot of debts. So if they cannot buy or get the 10 euros buy now pay later to buy the socks, they will get a credit card, or they'll get credit elsewhere at maybe even worse conditions. So the question is, are we going to solve the problem by putting all these requirements in the legislation? So I think, again, the balance is probably not at the right place at this moment.
No, absolutely. And it's certainly one to watch whether Buy Now Pay Later continues to be such a success story at the checkout. Certainly, there does seem to be a bit of a push from governments at the moment to try and increase consumer protection. I think Buy Now Pay Later providers are very in favour of there being regulatory clarity. Klarna and the like have previously said that they think having that regulatory clarity could actually be very beneficial for them in being to show that they are reputable, and that they, do have the protections there that credit cards and traditional forms of credit have. Now, a final piece that I think would be quite good for us to look at would be open banking. So I guess we are going back to the PSD3 and PSR world, but it's something that came up with alternative payment methods as well. We are starting to see some open banking payment methods, dare I say, go mainstream, which I think is the dream of regulators and fintechs alike across Europe. Ryanair, Just Eat, they've both been recently using open banking methods at the checkout. We've seen real success stories in the UK as well, actually, with people being able to pay their taxes using open banking. Are we about to see the open banking revolution happen?
Well, I don't know about that. I do think one of the big problems that we currently have with open banking is that every bank has its own API, and the requirements are not similar, and therefore, I think that's a big barrier to open banking. And actually, the PSD3 and PSR doesn't change anything on that, because it's still like a set of requirements without mandating like exactly what kind of API you have to deliver. Maybe that's also hard to do, but I think in the end, for open banking to really take off, it's very important that you have a very good customer experience. And if with the current system, which each bank having their own APIs and not being stimulated, not getting paid for offering those APIs and maintaining the APIs, etc., I think that is a big problem. So
Yeah.
so I think that's where the real challenge lies.
And I guess until then, merchants aren't going to be particularly interested in deploying open banking methods.
Well, it would certainly bring cost savings if they use the open banking, and obviously you need instant payments for this to really take off, because otherwise the merchants will need to wait a long time before they get the money. So but that's gonna happen. But no, usually it's like third-party providers who make it their business to, maintain or maintain connectivity to all of those APIs. It's not something that most of the merchants do themselves. If you have all these different APIs.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that open banking is definitely going to be one to watch. It seems like from the PSR and PSD3, there's going to be a lot more emphasis on enforcement, which I think could be really welcome. Enforcement has been pretty rare with open banking so far, so whether we start to see that happen will be one to watch in the coming years. Now, I appreciate we have gone slightly over time, but there is just so much to discuss with
I
regulation, isn't
know,
there?
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
and there's still more. So thank you so much, Ari, and thank you so much to the wonderful organisers at MPE as well for having us on to be able to talk about some of those compliance issues that are going to be coming up for merchants and payments providers in the next few years.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.